In this video tutorial, I will teach you about the ER model. E stands for entity and R for relation. So, entity relation model. What is entity relation model? It is the logical representation of the data for organization or business. Normally, it is expressed as an entity relationship diagram. We can say it as a ER diagram or simply ERD. We have three basics of ER model. First is the entity, second is the relationship, and third is the attribute. So now what is the entity? So we can, two terms are used for the normally for the entities, two conceptual terms. First is the entity instance and then entity type. Entity instance can be the person, place, object or event. In simple words, entity instance often correspond to a row in a table, row 1, row 2, row 3 and so on, or we can say a record of the table. And entity type is a collection of entity instance. We can say it as a table. So a table consists of many rows, many records, or we can say it table comprise of many entity instances. Relationship instance is a link between the two or more than two entities, or correspond to primary key, foreign key equivalence in a related table. Laterally, when we convert these entities into the tables, so we will then link the two tables, or we can say when we create a relationship between the instance, we will do it using primary and foreign key. And relationship type is a category of relationship link between the entity types. Attribute, it is a property or characteristic of an entity or relationship type, often correspond to a field in a table. So it is a field or column in a table. Every instance, every entity is recognized with its attributes. So an entity can consist of one or more than one attributes. And now modeling entities and attributes. So in this slide I will teach how we can model the entities and the attributes. Entity is a person, as stated, a place, an object, an event, or a concept in the user environment about which the organization wishes to maintain a data. For example, a person can be an employee, a student, a patient. A place can be any place like store, warehouse, a state. An object can be a machine, building, automobile. An event can be a sale, registration, renewal. And concept is account, course, work center, etc. So all these are the entity types. Entity. So entity type is a collection of entities, as stated in the previous slide, that entity type is a collection of entities that share common properties or characteristics. It is a given name, always singular, written in a capital letter as shown in the table. For example, if we see this table, employee written in the capital letter is the entity type, or we can say the table name. As lately when we convert the entity into table, so then we can say the employee table. An entity instance is a singular occurrence of an entity type. For example, in this entity type employee, there are two instances. One instance is shown in this column, and one instance in this column against these attributes. So these are the attributes of the employee. The first attribute is the employee number, second is the name, third is the address, city, state, zip code, date, hire, and birth date. And these are the attribute data type. Lately we will discuss about the data type. And these are the two instances. So we can create many instances. There is no bound on the instances, or we can say there are two records or rows. So against each attribute we have a particular value here. So entity type is a collection of entities, and entity instance is a single occurrence of entities as shown using this example. Attributes. An entity is described using a set of attributes whose values are used to distinguish one entity from another of the same type. All entities in a given entity set have the same attributes. The value may be different. For example, if we have two students, so both students will have IDs, roll number, name, contact, email, but the values will be different. Some of the values against particular attributes like address, like section, department can be repeated, but there must be certain attributes whose values should be unique for each entity instance. So for example, name, address, weight, height are properties of the person entity. An attribute may be required or optional. Domain. What is domain? The set of permitted values for each attribute. For example, name can be text string of the certain length. So this is the notation used for the attribute. So inside this notation we will write the attribute name. For example, name, address, weight, etc. This is the attribute example. This is the entity notation, which is the entity type here is the employee, and these are the attributes, the four attributes for this entity type. Now come to discuss the attribute types. We have four major types. The first type is a simple attribute, the second is the composite attribute, multi-value attribute, and the fourth is the derived attribute. Simple attribute contain only a single value. For example, employee, there are three attributes in this example: employee number, employee name, and employee ID. So this is a simple attribute. If we see this example, this is the example of composite attribute. What is composite attribute? Composite attributes can be divided into subparts. For example, here these two attributes, employee number, ID, are simple attribute, but name is a composite attribute which consists of first name, middle name, and last name. You have seen in many websites, when you fill the name, fill the data, and you fill the name, you write the name. So we have two spaces given, the first name and last name, or there can be three spaces for the first name, middle name, and the last name. Multi-value attribute is another attribute type which contain more than one values. For example, phone number. So a person or employee can have more than one phone number, and this is normal practice that mostly persons have more than one phone number. Email ID, we can have more than one email ID. So these attribute phone and email are the multi-value attributes. Derived attribute is computed from another attribute, means one attribute is derived from the another attribute. Like age can be derived from date of birth. So if for example the student data birth value is given, so we can easily calculate the age of that particular student from the date of birth. And bonus, so bonus is attribute which can only be calculated from the given salary or sale. Now we have identifiers, or we can say key, simple key. Identifier or key, it is an attribute or combination of more than one attributes that uniquely identifies individual instances of entity type. Means if we have, for example, 5 attributes, so there must be an attribute or combination of attributes which will identify the whole tuples or instances of the entity type. For example, employee ID can uniquely identify the whole instances of the entity type employee. What will be the characteristic of this identifier? The first characteristic will be that it cannot it must will not be null. Means null value cannot be inserted against against the identifier, and it must be a unique. This means 2 or more than 2 identifier values cannot be same for the entity type. Composite key, name or address alone. For example, in this diagram you can see that the name attribute and the address attribute, you cannot uniquely identify the whole entity type employee. Why? Because 2 or more than 2 employees can have same name, or 2 and 2 more than 2 employees can have same address. So in last slide you already seen that it is the characteristic of key, that identifier key, that it must be unique and cannot be null. So these two individually cannot identify the employee, but when we combine these two, so combinedly these two can identify the employee. If still these two combination of these two attributes, address and name, is unable to identify the whole record tuple, so we will then use another attribute in combination with along with these two attributes. Candidate key, as the name show, that the key which is candidate for the unique identifier. So an entity can have more than one candidate keys. For example, student, it can be the student ID, it can be the registration number, it can be the combination of more other attributes, composite attributes. So an entity can have more than one candidate key. One of them is selected as a prime key or primary key. So primary key is a single attribute, or it can be the composite attribute, but it must be only one. Means two attributes individually cannot be declared as a candidate for primary key, but the combination of these two can be declared as a primary key. For example, these two attributes, employee number and SS number. These two have the characteristic of the primary key or unique identifier. So these two are declared as a candidate key for primary key. So this one is selected, or we can select this one also. So this was all about the candidate key. Foreign key is a field in a relational table that matches a primary key column of one table with another. The foreign key can be used to cross different tables. In simple words, we can say that with using foreign key, we can connect or we interrelate the child table with the parent table that contains the primary key attributes, or simply we can say that foreign key interrelate two entities. So using primary key and foreign key, then we can interrelate the two tables. Identify the key attributes. So how we can then identify the key attributes? For example, department name can identify the department uniquely, because if we look into our departments, any department, university department, business department, so two departments cannot have the same name. If the two departments have the same name, this means it's a single department, so it can identify the department uniquely. Hence department name is the key attribute for the entity type department. Similarly, course ID is the key attribute for the course entity. Student ID is the key attribute for the student. Why name cannot be the key attribute? Because two or more than two students can have the same name, same address. So phone number, yes, phone number can be the key attribute, but there is a problem with phone number. It is possible that student have not a phone, there is no phone with the student, so null value will comes, and this is the characteristic of the key attribute, that null value will not exist, but student ID is a particular value that is assigned to the student during admission. Instructor ID is the key attribute for the instructor entity. So these were the few examples. If we see another examples, composite attribute, this is a composite attribute example, an attribute broken into component parts. For example, employee address is a composite attribute that can consist of the street address, that is composed of the street address, city, state, postal code. Multi-value attributes, multi-value attribute, an employee can have more than one skill. So skill is a multi-value. If we are entering the skills of the employee or any person, so it is possible that he have certain more than one skills, and this is years employed is a derived attribute from the date employed. So these were the few more examples. Simple and composite identifier attributes. So if we see, this is a simple identifier attribute, student name, student ID, student ID. So in this table or in this entity, the student ID attribute is a identifier attribute, and this is the composite identifier attribute. So here more than one attribute have the ability to identify the whole table entity type. So here flight ID, student ID is a simple identifier attribute, and flight ID, which consists of flight number, date, these two. So combining these two composite attributes identify the whole tuple. This attribute that is both multi-value and composite. So it is possible that a particular attribute is both multi-value and the composite. So we can see the product ID is both multi-value and composite. So it is composed of price history, effective date, and price. So product ID here is a both multi-value and composite. It is composed of the price history, effective date, price, and there can be multiple possible values for product ID due to the changing effective date, price, and price history. So there can be multiple possibility for attributes. So this was all about the entity and the attribute types and the relationship between these